Remember when a video game movie actually worked? Not just worked enough, but exploded into a full-blown franchise. Back in 2002, when most game adaptations were box office disasters, Resident Evil kicked down the door, fired a shotgun at expectations, and rewrote the rules. Audiences walked in thinking they knew exactly what they were about to see. Zombies, a creepy lab, some cheap jump scares, end of story. But what played out on screen was only half the madness. Behind the cameras, this movie was a chaotic experiment held together by last-minute rewrites, abandoned ideas, and decisions that nearly derailed the entire project. Scripts were scrapped, characters were rewritten on the fly, practical effects melted, actors got hurt, and some of the film's most iconic moments didn't even exist until weeks before shooting. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. This wasn't just another adaptation. It was a gamble that reshaped how Hollywood looked at video games, action heroines, and franchise filmmaking in the early 2000s. What you remember from the finished film is only the polished surface. The real story lives in the chaos underneath. So buckle up, because these are the weird, wild, and behind-the-scenes facts that turned a risky experiment into a global phenomenon. Number 1. The original vision was far darker, and it didn't survive the studio. Before this movie became a high-energy action horror ride, it was almost something completely different. The earliest version of the project aimed for a slow, claustrophobic descent into horror, closer to a classic zombie nightmare than a blockbuster action film. The tone leaned heavily toward atmosphere, tension, and isolation, with far less emphasis on gunfire and spectacle. That version terrified the studio. Executives worried the pacing was too deliberate, too grim, and too faithful to old-school horror sensibilities. They wanted something louder, faster, and more accessible to a mainstream audience that wasn't necessarily made up of hardcore gamers. The result was a major creative pivot. Scripts were abandoned, ideas were shelved, and the entire identity of the film shifted mid-development. What audiences eventually saw was a compromise. Horror streamlined into action, dread replaced with momentum. And while fans still debate what could have been, that decision ultimately defined the franchise's DNA for years to come. Number 2. The film's most iconic look came from an improvised choice. One of the most recognizable visual elements of the entire franchise was never planned. It wasn't in the script, it wasn't demanded by the studio, and it wasn't the result of a marketing meeting. It came from a spontaneous creative instinct on set. The idea was simple: place elegance where it didn't belong. Against sterile hallways, armored soldiers, and industrial metal corridors, the contrast needed to be striking. The look had to feel wrong in the best possible way. What started as a risky wardrobe choice quickly became a defining symbol of the character and, eventually, the entire series. That single visual decision reshaped posters, promotional material, fan cosplay, and even later entries in the franchise. It proved that sometimes the smallest creative risks leave the longest shadows. Number 3. One of the film's most brutal scenes was borrowed, not invented. The infamous trap sequence remains one of the most talked about moments in the movie. It's clean, it's silent, and it's merciless. But the idea didn't come from nowhere. The director openly drew inspiration from a late 90s cult science fiction film that relied on minimalist terror and mechanical inevitability. The concept was simple: take a clean, almost invisible threat and let anticipation do the damage before the violence ever arrives. What made the scene unforgettable wasn't excess, but restraint. No dramatic music, no exaggerated effects, just the slow realization that escape was impossible. The execution relied on a careful blend of practical effects, editing, and visual timing, proving that sometimes the most disturbing moments come from precision rather than chaos. Decades later, that scene is still referenced, parodied, and instantly recognized, even by people who've never watched the full film. Number 4. One cast member treated the role like a real combat mission. Some actors play tough, others train to look tough, but on this set, one performer took things far beyond what anyone expected. The character was written as disciplined, aggressive, and fearless, and the actor decided that meant there was no room for hesitation. Training sessions became personal challenges. Fight choreography turned into full contact encounters. During action scenes, hits landed harder than planned, props were knocked over, and minor injuries became routine. Crew members quickly realized this wasn't an act. This intensity followed every take. At one point, an injury occurred that should have stopped production entirely. Instead, filming continued. The pain was ignored, the scene finished, and only afterward did the seriousness of the injury become clear. The director eventually had to step in and remind the cast that this was still a movie, not an actual survival scenario. That raw commitment translated directly to the screen. The performance felt dangerous because, in many ways, it was. Viewers weren't just watching a hardened survivor, they were watching someone who refused to dial it back. Number 5. The production discovered that real animals don't respect horror makeup. Some of the film's most unsettling creatures weren't created with computers. They were real animals placed inside elaborate prosthetics and practical effects. On paper, it sounded perfect. In practice, it was a nightmare. Under hot studio lights, latex began to soften. Prosthetic pieces slipped out of place. The animals reacted exactly as animals do, licking, scratching, and tearing at anything uncomfortable. Entire takes were ruined in seconds. Makeup teams worked non-stop, constantly reapplying effects that refused to stay intact. At one point, a full setup was destroyed in the most humiliating way possible, forcing the crew to reset everything from scratch. Treats, praise, and patience became survival tools behind the camera. And yet, when the final footage came together, the chaos paid off. Those moments feel unpredictable and feral because they were. The tension wasn't manufactured, it was barely controlled. Number 6. Tension between performers wasn't just scripted. When two strong personalities collide on screen, chemistry can spark. Off-screen, that same energy can turn volatile. Both performers insisted on handling their own stunts, pushing scenes to physical extremes. As choreography intensified, so did frustration. Disagreements broke out during rehearsals. Some hits landed harder than planned. Words were exchanged. Bruises were collected. Neither side backed down. But something strange happened in the process. Mutual respect formed through impact and exhaustion. By the time filming wrapped, what started as friction evolved into trust. The performances worked because they weren't polished or overly safe. They felt earned. The aggression, the tension, and the unspoken rivalry translated directly into the final cut, giving their scenes a sharp edge that couldn't have been faked. Sometimes, real conflict creates the most believable connections. Number 7. A major role was recast after filming had already begun. Most casting changes happened quietly during pre-production. This one didn't. A key character had already been filmed in multiple scenes when the production made a sudden decision to move in a different direction. The reasons were never fully explained. Creative differences were mentioned. Tone mismatches were rumored. What mattered was the result. Entire sequences had to be reshot, schedules were rearranged, and continuity became a silent nightmare for the editing team. If you look closely, traces of the original performance still linger. A reflection here, a shadow there. Blink and you'll miss it, but those fragments remain, frozen reminders of a version of the film that almost existed. Ironically, the actor moved on without public resentment, later appearing in a completely different role within the broader genre. But for a brief moment, the movie balanced between two identities, and only one of them survived the cut. Number 8. The creatures moved wrong on purpose. There's something deeply unsettling about the way the infected move in this film. They don't simply shuffle forward. They twitch, they hesitate, they jerk in unnatural rhythms that feel almost choreographed. That wasn't accidental. Instead of hiring random extras and instructing them to act dead, the production brought in performers trained to control their bodies with precision. Movement became performance art. Each creature was designed to reflect a different stage of infection, from barely human to fully overtaken. This approach added unpredictability. No two figures moved the same way. Some lunged suddenly, others dragged themselves forward with disturbing restraint. The result was a swarm that felt alive, diseased, and unstable. It wasn't just makeup selling the horror. It was posture, balance, and intention. The human body twisted just enough to trigger discomfort before fear even set in. Number 9. The movie broke a sacred rule, and fans noticed immediately. For an adaptation rooted in a massively popular franchise, this film made a bold and risky decision. It ignored familiar faces, no iconic heroes, no recognizable leads pulled directly from the source material. Instead, the story introduced an entirely new protagonist. For longtime fans, the reaction was immediate confusion. Was this still the same world without the characters they knew? The choice was controversial, but it was strategic. New characters meant freedom. Freedom to rewrite outcomes. Freedom to take risks. Freedom to kill without breaking established canon. Over time, familiar figures would appear in later installments, but this first entry stood apart. It wasn't a retelling, it was a reimagining. And that gamble paid off by creating a central figure who would carry the franchise far longer than anyone expected. Sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to build something that lasts. Number 10. Some of the film's most claustrophobic spaces were real. One reason the environment feels so oppressive is because, in several key scenes, it actually was. Instead of relying entirely on constructed sets, the production chose to film inside a genuine underground facility originally built decades earlier for an entirely different purpose. Thick concrete walls closed in from every side. Corridors echoed unnaturally. The air felt stale, heavy, and unmoving. This wasn't a place designed for comfort, and it showed. Actors have since admitted that simply being there changed how they performed. Panic didn't need to be imagined. It crept in naturally. Lighting rigs were deliberately unstable, flickering at irregular intervals to maintain unease. Silence became part of the atmosphere. Every footstep felt louder than it should have. That authenticity couldn't be replicated on a soundstage. The location grounded the story in something tangible. Even when the plot leaned into science fiction, the setting kept it uncomfortably real. Number 11. The main character wasn't meant to lead the story. In early drafts, the central figure was never intended to dominate the narrative. The script was structured as an ensemble, with attention spread evenly across the group. No single character was designed to carry the emotional weight of the film. That changed quickly. Once production began, it became obvious that one performance demanded focus. The camera lingered longer, scenes were adjusted, dialogue shifted. Action beats were rewritten to revolve around a single presence. What began as a supporting role expanded organically into the core of the story. This evolution wasn't planned, it was reactive, and it forced the filmmakers to rethink the entire trajectory of the franchise moving forward. By the end of filming, the transformation was complete. A character who barely existed in early drafts became the face of the series for years. Sometimes stars aren't created in pre-production. They emerge when no one is looking away. Number 12. A disturbing concept was removed, but traces of it remain. Early versions of the story leaned heavily into a more grotesque method of spreading the outbreak. The idea was intentionally uncomfortable, designed to push body horror to the forefront and blur the line between science fiction and pure nightmare. Ultimately, the concept was abandoned. The decision came down to clarity and pacing. The filmmakers worried that the idea, while horrifying, would complicate the narrative and distract from momentum. But removing it entirely proved impossible. Elements of the concept were already embedded in the visual language of the film. If you look closely, remnants are still there. In the way the infection behaves, in the design of certain creatures, in the speed and aggression of the transformation, the influence never fully disappeared. It was simply buried beneath a more streamlined explanation. The result is a film that hints at something even darker just beneath the surface, a version of the story that was deemed too unsettling to fully unleash. Number 13. The film's most chilling presence was modeled after something real. One of the coldest, most unsettling elements in the entire movie isn't a monster or a weapon. It's calm, it's quiet, and it looks harmless at first glance. That was intentional. The creative team wanted an authority figure that felt familiar but wrong, something that didn't raise its voice or show emotion, yet carried absolute control. To achieve that effect, they studied real human behavior, particularly the expressions and mannerisms of children delivering neutral statements without emotional weight. That contrast did all the work. The face remained soft, the tone stayed polite. The message, however, was brutal. By grounding this presence in reality rather than exaggeration, the film created something far more disturbing than a traditional villain. It wasn't angry, it wasn't cruel, it was efficient. That decision elevated the threat beyond physical danger. It made the environment itself feel hostile, as if logic and empathy had been removed entirely from the system. Number 14. The sound design attacked the audience before the visuals did. Long before the creatures fully reveal themselves, the film begins unsettling viewers through sound alone. The noises don't just accompany the horror, they anticipate it. Instead of relying on standard effects, the sound team built their audio palette using altered recordings of real animals. Screams were slowed down, growls were stretched and distorted. Familiar noises were warped until they felt wrong, but still recognizable on a subconscious level. That recognition is key. Your brain reacts before you understand why. The sounds trigger instinctive discomfort, creating tension even when nothing is happening on screen. By the time the threat appears visually, the audience is already on edge. This approach turned audio into a psychological weapon. The fear wasn't just seen, it was felt, deep and immediate, bypassing logic entirely. Number 15. One of the film's most shocking moments was added at the last minute. The opening sequence didn't always look the way audiences remember it. In fact, it was heavily revised late in production. Early versions moved slowly, easing viewers into the world with exposition and setup. That wasn't enough. The filmmakers needed an instant statement, something that made it clear from the very first minutes that this story would be unforgiving. So, a new idea was introduced under intense time pressure, requiring fast construction, clever camera work, and practical effects executed with precision. The result was brief, brutal, and unforgettable. That single addition changed the entire tone of the film. It warned the audience immediately: survival wouldn't be guaranteed, and mercy wouldn't be offered. Sometimes one scene is all it takes to reset expectations, and this one did exactly that. Number 16. One of the film's most terrifying creatures was built before computers took over. Before digital effects became the default solution, this production committed to building something real. A full-scale creature was constructed using mechanical components, cables, and handcrafted detailing. It moved, it breathed, it existed on set. Up close, it was grotesque and disturbingly tangible. Muscles twitched, limbs flexed, fluids dripped under the lights. But there was a problem. While it looked horrifying in person, its movement was limited. Fast action revealed the illusion too clearly. The solution was a compromise. The practical version remained for close-up shots, shadows, and brief reveals, while digital work handled the more aggressive movements. If you know where to look, you can still spot the physical build lurking in certain frames, a relic of an era when monsters were touched, not rendered. That blend of real and digital gave the creature weight. Even when the visuals moved too fast to analyze, the presence felt solid, grounded, and real. Number 17. The villain's corporate image was designed to feel uncomfortably familiar. The fictional megacorporation at the heart of the story doesn't look evil in a theatrical way. There are no sharp edges or gothic flourishes. Everything is clean, minimal, corporate. That was deliberate. Designers studied real-world pharmaceutical branding from the mid-20th century, borrowing visual language associated with trust, medicine, and authority. Colors were chosen to feel sterile. Logos were simplified. Fonts were pulled from real industrial documentation. The goal was subtlety. The corporation wasn't meant to feel like science fiction. It was meant to feel possible, the kind of company you might already recognize, just pushed one step too far. That realism made the threat more disturbing than any monster. The horror wasn't just biological, it was bureaucratic. And that's why the symbol stuck. It didn't scream danger, it whispered it. Number 18. The entire film was edited like controlled chaos. If the movie feels relentless, that's because it was designed to be. The editing style was inspired by the music and visual culture of the early 2000s. Fast cuts, aggressive pacing, movement tied directly to rhythm. Action scenes weren't just assembled, they were timed. Shots were cut to beats, camera movements matched musical accents. Silence was used strategically, not for calm, but for disorientation. The audience was never meant to settle in. The film wanted momentum, not comfort. This approach turned the movie into a continuous surge of energy. Even dialogue scenes felt like they were moving toward impact. The result was a style that some critics found exhausting, but many viewers found addictive. It locked the film into its era and gave it an identity that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Number 19. Everyday objects became iconic props by accident. Some of the most recognizable items in the film look like high-tech creations designed by a futuristic laboratory. Sleek, minimal, almost too perfect. But the truth behind them is far less sophisticated. The production team repurposed existing consumer objects and modified them just enough to feel advanced. With a few alterations, lighting elements, and careful framing, ordinary items were transformed into symbols of biotechnological danger. This decision wasn't just practical, it was effective. Because the objects felt real, they grounded the science fiction elements in reality. Audiences believed in them instantly. Fans later recreated them for cosplay, and future entries in the franchise adopted similar designs, turning a quick prop solution into a visual standard. Sometimes the most enduring imagery comes not from elaborate design meetings, but from creative improvisation under pressure. Number 20. The ending was rewritten to promise something bigger. The film was never meant to end the way audiences remember it. The original conclusion was smaller, quieter, and more contained. It resolved the immediate story, then faded out. Test audiences wanted more. They wanted scale, they wanted consequences, they wanted to see what happened next. So the filmmakers went back and reworked the final moments, expanding the ending into something far more ambitious. What emerged was a closing image designed to function as a statement. The story wasn't over, it was only beginning. That final sequence didn't just close a chapter. It opened a door to a larger world, one built for continuation. That decision reshaped everything that followed. Sequels were greenlit, a franchise was cemented, and a single film evolved into a long-running series that refused to stay buried. Looking back, Resident Evil wasn't a carefully engineered masterpiece. It was a controlled risk, a patchwork of abandoned ideas, last-minute decisions, and creative gambles that shouldn't have worked together. But they did. What emerged was something imperfect, aggressive, and unforgettable. A film that didn't just adapt a game, but carved out its own identity and reshaped expectations in the process. Its legacy isn't built on perfection, it's built on survival. And sometimes, that's what makes a story worth remembering.